You hear the cry before you see him, something between a shout and a moan rolling down the street ahead of the cart. Rag bone, any old iron. You know the words, you've run out with whatever your mum could spare, and if you were lucky, he'd hand you a goldfish and a bag of water in return. 28 million people watched a version of this man on television every single week at his peak. Then one morning, the street went quiet. Here's what happened. The rag and bone man is one of the oldest trades in British urban life. The first written record of someone doing this job appears in the Old Bailey proceedings in 1802, describing an old rag and bone picker in the street, though the trade itself is older than that. He went by several names: Totter, bone-grubber, bone picker, rag gatherer. The name tells you exactly what the job was. He took what nobody else wanted, and he found a use for it. The rags were sold to merchants by weight, who recycled them into a rough cloth called shoddy or into paper. The bones, and these were animal bones, the ones left over after a family had boiled them clean for soup, were sold to be ground into bone meal fertilizer or boiled down for glue. The word bonfire, incidentally, comes from bone fire. The original bonfire was a pile of bones being rendered down. This is a trade that is literally written into the language. For most of his history, the rag and bone man was at the very bottom of the social order. Victorian accounts describe men and women scavenging on foot, carrying large bags over their shoulders, surviving on whatever the day's collection brought in. In 1958, a Manchester Guardian reporter accompanied a rag and bone man called John Bibby on his rounds through Chorlton and Stretford. For a full handcart load, rags, furs, shoes, scrap car parts, a settee, and assorted furniture. Bibby made about £2 for a full cart, and he was considered to be doing reasonably well. On a good day, the Manchester Guardian noted, a man could earn as much as £25 from a single round if the quality of what he collected was high. But those days were rare, and the work was relentless. Up before dawn, out in all weathers, covering the same streets week after week, building the kind of relationship with a neighbourhood that only comes from showing up every single time. The trade ran on margins that would make most people turn around and go home, but it also served a purpose that nothing else quite replicated, because the rag and bone man would take anything from anyone and pay something for it, even if that something was a balloon and a goldfish. That exchange, the goldfish for the jumper, the balloon for the bag of old clothes, is one of the most specifically remembered details of British childhood from the 1940s through to the 1970s. It wasn't much of a transaction on paper, a goldfish in a bag of water for a bundle of rags your mother had set aside, a donkey stone used for scrubbing the front step, handed over in exchange for whatever you could find. But children ran out for it. They ran out for the horse too, to give it an apple or a lump of sugar to pat its nose while the man loaded the cart. The horse knew the route. He would stop at each house and wait without being told, because he had done it enough times to understand what was expected. Not a machine, a neighbourhood fixture, as familiar as the lamppost. So that's what existed. A trade that had been running, in one form or another, since before anyone could remember, serving a Britain where nothing was wasted and everything had a second life. Now here's what happened to it, because the way it ended is actually more interesting than the way it survived. The first thing was the council. From the 1950s onward, local councils expanded their refuse collection services, offering regular curbside pickup of bulky items that had previously only the rag and bone man would take. The practical justification for going out to meet the cart started to disappear. You no longer needed to save your bones and your old clothes and your broken furniture for the man with the horse. The council lorry would take it, and unlike the rag and bone man, the council would take it away every single week without fail, without negotiation, and without offering you a goldfish in return. The informal economy that the Totter had operated within for a century started to be replaced by a formal one, not a transaction, a collection, and that difference mattered more than it sounds. The second thing was the television. In 1962, the BBC broadcast the first episode of Steptoe and Son, a comedy written by Ray Galton and Alan Simpson about a father and son rag and bone business at Oil Drum Lane in Shepherd's Bush. Wilfred Bramble played the filthy, manipulative Albert. Harry H. Corbett played Harold, his son, who wanted desperately to be something else and never quite managed it. The show became one of the most watched programmes in British television history. At its peak, 28 million people tuned in per episode. In 1966, Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, personally asked the BBC to delay transmission of an episode on general election night because he was worried it would keep Labour voters at home. That is the level of grip this programme had on the country, and what it did to the rag and bone man's reputation, without quite meaning to, was fix him in the public imagination as a figure of pathos and decline rather than a working tradesman. Not a profession, a punchline. The real men doing the real job were still out there, but the fictional version had got there first. By the mid-1960s, the trade was already in serious decline. In the 1950s, Manchester and Salford alone had around 60 rag merchants between them. By 1978, that number had dropped to 12. A 1965 newspaper report estimated that in London only a few hundred rag and bone men remained. The ones who survived mostly moved sideways into the scrap metal trade, which had better margins and didn't require you to know what to do with a bag of old bones. The horse and cart gave way to the van. The cry in the street gave way to a megaphone. The goldfish stopped. Not a trade adapting, a trade ending, slowly, and replacing itself with something that looked similar but felt entirely different. There is a brief footnote in the early 2000s worth mentioning. The price of scrap metal surged globally. Copper, aluminium, steel all became significantly more valuable, and a van-based version of the rag and bone trade briefly returned to British streets. Men in flatbed transits calling through megaphones, taking white goods and old fridges and whatever you had at the curb. You might have seen one, or heard one. But by then the law had changed considerably. Anyone collecting waste commercially now needed an Environment Agency waste carrier license. The informal economy that had sustained the original trade for centuries was no longer legal to operate without paperwork. And the figure who emerged from that new framework was a van driver with a license, not a totter, with a horse who knew the street by memory. But here's what I think actually disappeared. The rag and bone man was the last regular visitor to the street who came specifically to receive things from you, rather than sell them to you or collect a payment or deliver something. Every other figure who came to the door, the milkman, the postman, the coalman, was bringing something. The rag and bone man was the only one you went out to meet with your arms full. The transaction ran the other way. You gave him things, he took them away and found them a use. And there was a kind of dignity in that, on both sides. You were not throwing something away, you were passing it on to someone who knew its worth. And he was not begging or scavenging, whatever the Victorian papers might have said about the trade. He was performing a service that the street genuinely needed, which is why the street met him at the curb, rather than waiting for him to come to the door. The act of doing that, of handing over what you no longer needed and watching it go somewhere rather than into a bin, connected you to a chain of use and reuse that went back centuries. Not waste, material, not rubbish, resource. And when he stopped coming, that connection broke, and the bin bag replaced it, and what had been a relationship became a disposal. You can still find the occasional totter, if you live in the right part of the country. A flatbed transit moving slowly down a residential street. A megaphone calling for scrap. But the exchange is gone. The horse is gone, and the goldfish is most certainly gone. Not a trade, a memory. Search for your nearest waste disposal centre tonight. It will ask you to bring your own items and sort them into the correct skips yourself. The rag and bone man is still out there, just about, in the occasional van on a Saturday morning, and in the memory of everyone who ever ran out to meet the cart with something tucked under their arm. The horse that knew the route, the cry that carried down the street, the goldfish in the bag. It was built on the idea that nothing was so broken or so worn out that it had no value left in it, and that the man who understood that was worth meeting at the curb every single week for as long as he came. It never needed to be more than that. Tell me in the comments, do you remember your rag and bone man? What did you get for your rags? Who brought it out to him? And do you remember the name of the horse? If you found this worth your time, subscribing helps me know there's interest in these topics.